Today is your lucky day because you're gonna learn how to make your own amazing, naturally fermented, homemade sauerkraut. And it's super easy to do. It's a no-brainer if you love sauerkraut as much as I do, and it's costing you a lot of money to buy really good quality organic stuff. You can make it yourself if you have the time. It doesn't actually take too much time, and it's not as big of a headache as a lot of people make it out to be. You can use pretty much any kind of cabbage as far as I know. I stick to the ones that have high water content or are pretty dense because that'll make your sauerkraut crunchier. So you want to usually make your sauerkraut the same day that you buy your cabbage, or within a couple of days. Even a week is okay, but keep it super well packed in your refrigerator so that no water is escaping. So you're essentially, big picture, going to take your cabbage and chop it up on a very sterile and clean work surface with clean knives and things and cutting boards, and chop it up finely if you like finely chopped sauerkraut. You're gonna throw it in a bowl on a scale, and you're gonna weigh it, and whatever that ends up weighing, you wanna add 2% of that in salt. I like to use regular kosher coarse cooking salt, but you can use probably any kind of salt. And so I have 1,160 grams of cabbage. So I'm gonna add 23 grams of salt. So I'm gonna add that and weigh that out. 23 grams of salt. And what I love doing here, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos on this. I love watching YouTube videos. And people spend half of the YouTube video telling everybody to like their channel or subscribe. Makes me a little bit crazy because I'm not there to subscribe to their channel forever. I just want to get the information that I need and then peace out. But here we go, 23 grams of salt. And I'm gonna pour that straight onto my cabbage in my bowl. Let me show you a picture of that. And I also added freshly cut dill because I love dill in my sauerkraut. Some people also like to add freshly ground ginger and turmeric. There's all kinds of things you can add. Read about it, research. Those are the main things that I've heard. I don't love the ginger thing, it's a little intense. I love garlic in my sauerkraut. That makes a really big difference. Just 2 cloves for a whole head of garlic is going to be enough just to create some sharp contrast to your sauerkraut. So essentially, I'm going to chop up a couple of cloves of garlic, and then I'm going to mix everything with my hands, and I'm not going to start doing the whole crunching thing because my poor little hands and forearms get tired even though I'm quite strong. I'm going to let the salt do the work for me. So once I've mixed it up a little bit, I'm gonna put a lid on this so that no more water escapes, so it stays fresh and crunchy. And then I'm gonna let it sit for 30 minutes, at least, maybe 40. But either way, I'm gonna let it sit so that the salt pulls the fluids out of the cabbage, all the juices out of the cabbage, and that's how you get the juice that is in the jars. It doesn't come from added anything. It all comes from your cabbage that you chopped up. And there's a maceration process that happens where the salt pulls all the juices out of the cabbage for you. That way, when I come back after 30 minutes, I have to mix a little bit and crunch a little bit to squeeze out some of the juice, but most of it is already done for me. So I'll see you in 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 30 minutes since I let my cabbage sit. I took the lid off and I started running my hands through it. And as you can see, it's nice and juicy now. I have worked it a little tiny bit. I just, kind of ran through it and just squeezed gently, for maybe 5 minutes or so. And I've got quite a bit of juice at the bottom of my jar. I'm gonna see if I can show you this. It's harder to see with the red cabbage, the purple liquid, but hopefully you can see that there is juice in there. So yeah, basically the next step is to put it all into a container in which the fermentation process is going to happen. I don't have, like I said, one of those fancy fermentation pots. but you can use one of those. You could order them. They're pretty expensive, and until you know whether or not you actually like making your own sauerkraut and it's worth it, you might just want to use a regular old glass jar. I like to use the mason jars. This one's the 32 ounce, I think. Wide mouth, super important, because here's the deal. You're gonna have to weight down your cabbage below the juice line to prevent mold from growing on your cabbage. So the best way to do that is just to make sure that all of your cabbage, every single little piece, stays submerged within the cabbage salt brine juice blend. And how I do that is I use one of these wide mouth large jars. You can also use these ones. They work really well too, like both. This one's the 28 ounce, I think, or maybe 24, I'm not sure. Anyway, large mason jar, baby mason jar. And I use the baby mason jar in the weight of this glass. And I basically fill up my jar just tall enough so that when I put the lid on, I'm squeezing and pushing this glass, and I'm pushing the cabbage down below its juice line so that I can close the whole jar and push and weight down the cabbage below its juices. So I'm gonna go ahead and fill this up quickly. And as I do that, I'm gonna use the mortar and pestle thing to push and jam the cabbage in there. I'll start and I'll show you. Here is my little pestle. Yes, I think that's what part that is. Anyway, I'm gonna fill up this jar, which is super clean, and I'm gonna start jam packing the cabbage in there. I just want to squeeze it all in, and I want to make sure that there's as little air in here as possible. So I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to fill it all the way up, and then I'll be right back. And for my next trick, I'm going to show you. I have filled the cabbage into the jars now, and you can see this one filled up almost to the top. I don't, again, want to fill it all the way to the top because I want to use something to weight it down. You can buy fancy glass weights on Amazon and things specifically for this purpose. And at this point, I might actually invest in that. But what works well for me is these little glass jars. They do the trick. They do fill up with the brine itself, and then some of that stays shallow at the bottom, and maybe that could be producing mold, although I haven't actually seen mold in there. I usually throw that part out if brine sits there like sort of by itself in a little shallow pool over the course of the fermentation process. But this works well enough for me. So you'll see actually, if I set the camera back up, you'll actually see that when I put this jar in, it's gonna push down the cabbage, and then it's gonna raise the juices. So hopefully you can see that. And then when I go to put a lid on, so look closely, if I push down, liquid goes up. I release, liquid goes down. Liquid goes up, liquid goes down. Okay, so I basically want the rim of this inner jar to be in line with the rim of the outer jar so that when the lid goes on, it applies pressure, and then the cabbage is submerged. If you see like any tiny little pieces of dill, see all these guys? Everything that is not submerged might mold. So be a little controlling about that and make sure that you wipe that clean. Sanitation station, my friends. So now for the other one, I'm going to use also a small jar. I have two small jars. I happen to have them clean. These are really good for making jams and holding sauces and vinaigrettes and things as well. I am a jar queen. Life in jars. Anyway, same thing here. My liquid was up to about there. I'm going to push down here. The inner rim of the jar you can see is well below. But I have so much juice, I poured the rest of the juice from the bowl into this jar that it doesn't really matter. I've got a couple of floaters here I'm not too concerned. They're mostly submerged, and I'm gonna take a gamble and see what happens. As long as there's very little surface area of organic matter that is not submerged, you will not get mold, or you will minimize your mold content, okay? Next very important step. I would make sure that you do not use those metal bands, the ones that come with the jars. Did I say that I was the mason jar queen? I wasn't kidding. You can see how obsessed I am with mason jars, how many of these I actually have. But basically, I don't like using these because the way that I do my fermentation, I don't seal the jar completely. If you seal the jar completely, what happens is the bacteria can ferment and break down the cabbage faster in the absence of air, and maybe even better. I haven't noticed a difference in taste though. My third batch was really, really good, and I did my own self-burping method. They sell all kinds of contraptions, these fancy gas release things with little liquid chambers in the middle to equalize the pressure, because what happens is as the bacteria breaks down or ferments, air is released or created and released. And you can imagine if your jar is sealed completely, it could actually become a little bomb. It's a little problem because it's glass and you don't really want a glass explosion in your kitchen. So I think it's best to avoid the whole burping thing. Another option is to screw on your lid, and then to every day, every 24 hours, open it up slowly and just allow the air to release out. It'll make this sound. It might not make a sound at all, but air is coming out and you'll see bubbles come up to the surface when you open it. You don't want to open it completely is what they say. And then you close it back up, and you're keeping this in a cupboard, in a dark cupboard. Absence of light is good. Here's what I found. If I leave the lid on and I don't burp it on time, even if I burp it once a day, I started getting liquids coming out of the top, and it was making a mess in my cupboard. So I thought to myself, why don't I just not screw the lid on all the way? Because some people use fancy pots that don't minimize air contact at all. It's just an open pot that's just weighted down. So I figured, what is this obsession? And I still haven't figured out what the obsession is with the closed tight lid and burping or using the fancy valves and whatever, because this method is easy and it works really well. So here's the deal. You're gonna put a lid on and you're gonna loosely screw it on. Not loosely, but tight enough that it's not airtight, but will allow air out. Okay, that's the main thing, because it is going to create air and air is going to come out, and sometimes liquid will come out too with that air as the pressure is built up. The looser it is, the less pressure will build up, the less liquid will come out. So my solution is to put a lid on and then put the whole thing in a baking glass Pyrex oven dish, so that it catches all the liquid and I don't have to worry about burping it. I literally put my last batch all like that in a glass oven dish in my cupboard, and I kind of forgot about it for a couple of weeks until finally I tasted it and I was like, oh my goodness, this tastes amazing. It's done. I don't need to keep fermenting it. When it's done, you can just put it in your fridge. Now, back to the lids. These guys are not rust proof, as you've noticed probably. All of your mason lid things, that come with the jars are not really rust proof. They're not made of stainless steel. And this is brine. It's salty stuff. And so corrosion happens. And then it's a pain in the butt because it ruins all of your things. So then I went online and started researching really fancy stainless steel mason lids. And I paid money for the leak-proof versions and whatever. And I'll tell you, I came back to the simplest solution yet. Let's hope I can find one right now. Now, don't hate me because I use plastic, but sometimes this is the cheapest, easiest solution. These are actually leak-proof. I've tested them multiple times. So you can just use one of these. This is also made by Ball. It's the same company who makes the mason jars or a similar company. And as you can see, I've got my little mini jar in here. I'm gonna squeeze this down and you can see that the liquid rises up and everything is submerged. Now here, uh-oh, danger alert. We've got floaters. So I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna push those down and make sure that whatever's floating is submerged, okay? Every little piece. I'm gonna do that with both of them. I am not gonna close them until they are completely solid because I don't wanna create a bomb. I wanna allow the air to flow out. A little bit of air is gonna get in, but it all ends up being okay. And then I'm gonna put them in that oven dish in the cupboard and I'm gonna let it sit. And depending on how warm it is in your house, it's going to ferment at a certain rate. Typically speaking, 1 to 2 weeks is good. Summertime weather, when it's a lot warmer in your place or around, obviously not if you have air conditioning, but if it's warm, then it will go faster. It might only take a few days. So I would be tasting it regularly and checking it out and just seeing at what point it's strong enough and tastes good to you. At which point you can put it in your fridge to stop the fermentation or seriously slow the fermentation process. And you can take out your little inner jar. It doesn't have to be fully submerged anymore. Everything changes once it's in the fridge because everything slows down. So mold is not as much of an issue. And my kraut doesn't last more than a month because I eat it all, but you could probably keep it in there for a long time and it wouldn't mold and wouldn't have issues. So last thing I was gonna say was, if it's cold, then it might take a little bit longer. It might take a couple weeks or maybe even a little bit longer than that. So just keep tasting it and checking on it and making sure it's okay. Make sure you don't have mold growing, make sure that you don't have whatever. Once you're sure, this is why I like to be really anal and compulsive about it at the start, before I put it in the cupboard, so that when I put it in the cupboard, I don't have to pay attention to it again until one day I'm like, oh yeah, I made kraut, how is that doing? And then I go taste it and it tastes amazing. But if you have floaters or you're a little sloppy at the onset, then you might end up with mold and issues and it'll ruin your batch and then it's like all this work for nothing. So don't let there be floaters. All right, I hope this is super helpful. I hope I haven't forgotten anything. And if you have any questions, call me.